crisis that they don't have to be cuts. We know how to get out of a Great Depression. You spend money. If we take a look at the typical worker, they're not doing fine.
Hi, I'm Dean Baker. I'm the host of the podcast Mostly Economics. I'm happy to have here with me today Jamie Love, who's the director of Knowledge Ecology International. Jamie is, to my view, he's the go-to person on patents and copyrights because he's been in the weeds on it in a way that I can never hope to be. So if there's ever a question I need an answer to, I could almost always count on Jamie to either know the answer or know where to send me to find the answer. He's also one of these people that's been working in Washington for decades and doing extremely important work. There's an old line about how in Washington there's a strict division of labor between the people who do the work and the people who get the credit. And Jamie's definitely on the side of the people who do the work. So I'm very happy to have you here today, Jamie.
Well, thank you for those kind words.
Well, what I wanted to talk about, and it's unfortunately very much in the news today, first and foremost, I should say, because we'll talk about more in this, but what I wanted to talk about was the origins of the AIDS program for Africa, PREPAR, that Jamie really played an instrumental role in. And it's little known. I mean, I want Jamie's role to be known, but it's also important for people to know what was involved in getting that set up. So if I could ask you, Jamie, to take us back to the 1990s, I guess we'd be talking about early, mid-1990s, and the AIDS pandemic in Africa, and where it stood in terms of getting the life-saving drugs, really, it's not at all exaggeration, life-saving drugs to the people who were suffering from AIDS in Africa at that time.
Well, thank you. And I think it is an important story. For me, I started taking interest in pharmaceutical drugs and the pricing of drugs around 1991 when I was asked by Congressman Wyden he made the request initially to Ralph Nader to look at an agreement between a drug company, Bristol Myers Squibb, and the NIH on the pricing and development of an NIH invented drug for cancer, Taxol. And over the next couple of years, I developed, I think, a bit of a following for the work I was doing on looking at drug pricing and the role of government in funding research and things like that. And then at one point, I got invitations from different countries that were involved in trade disputes with the United States. And in 1997, the call came in to Robert Weissman and myself from the health ministry in South Africa. And they were going to modify this was when Mbeki was the president of South Africa, and they had only recently been out of apartheid. So they were really, it was a new constitution, it was a new legal system, and they were kind of feeling their way. And the United States government had a commission to manage the transition or the new relationship with the country post-apartheid. It was co-chaired by Vice President of the United States, Al Gore, and Vice President then of South Africa, which was Mbeki. And so these health ministers were coming to Washington, D.C. for meetings with the U.S. Officials talking about the trade relationships. And they were asked to have meetings with drug companies about changes in the South Africa patent law and Medicines Act. It was a controversy. And so Rob and I were asked to advise the South Africans or give them some support in the negotiation. The Clinton administration somehow found out that we were going to be involved in some way, and they sent down the note that neither Rob or I would be allowed to be in any meetings that the South Africans had with the drug companies talking about their patent law. But I then developed a pretty close relationship throughout that whole year in the lead up to the passage in the fall of the Medicines Act. And I remember talking to the South Africans at the time and encouraging them to do compulsory licensing on the patents for HIV drugs, because I don't know if people can remember, but up until around 1995, 1996, no one really thought that any of the drugs for HIV worked very well. People were taken AZT, and even AZT in combination with 3-TC, which was known as Combivir. And it had some benefit, but AIDS patients were still dying in very large numbers in the United States and around the world. And then when people started using triple therapy, which was a three different combination therapy together, it was shocking to find out that Magic Johnson, wasn't going to die, and it was kind of an amazing moment when you found that people that you just sort of took for granted were going to die really didn't have to die. It was a really great moment.
Just to stop for a second, just to emphasize, Jamie and I are both old now, but AIDS was basically a death sentence if you got it in the 80s, and AZT was a great drug. It relieved the symptoms and people could live more normal lives, but it's lost effectiveness through time, and it didn't change the fact that even if you're taking AZT, you would likely die. I don't know if everyone did, but your prospects were not good. We'll just put it that way. So sorry for the interruption.
No, it's true. Like monotherapy was not that effective, and dual therapy was a little bit better, but triple therapy was this quantum jump in effectiveness. And so by 1997, you knew that if you lived in the United States, that there was a very effective treatment for HIV available. And it was just not really widely available throughout the world. There were some countries that were providing dual therapy, but for the most part, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, almost no one was getting treatment that wasn't white. I think there was later on when I was involved in a competition case in South Africa. I think the estimate was that maybe 20,000 people in sub-Saharan Africa were under treatment. This was later on. It wasn't even 1997. It was like 2003.
Yeah, just to be clear, the drug companies here were charging on the order of 10 to 15,000 a year for the treatment, and needless to say, in South Africa or really anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa, that was prohibitive.
Yeah, it was definitely prohibited. So a 10 to 15 was probably the right amount for a triple therapy back then. In the late 90s. And I think the estimates were at one point there was about 35 million people that were infected in sub-Saharan Africa, and that 9,000 people were dying every day from HIV. There were some surveys that were done at universities where they found that in South Africa, which is the epicenter was really Southern Africa for cultural reasons. And so, there was some surveys done of college students where they'd say that 24% of the student body was infected with HIV. And at that point, you pretty much had a life expectancy of no more than 10 years after you're infected, if you weren't under treatment. So it was, people were losing doctors, they were losing teachers, they were losing, it was ripping through society. And so I was very interested in that. And the problem I had, part of the problem in dealing with HIV in Africa was about South Africa, and part of it was the rest of the continent. And the reason I mention that is because Mbeki, who became the president of South Africa after Nelson Mandela, decided not to run for another term, had been going on the internet, and he'd been running into the same kind of people that Robert F. K. Jr. Quoted extensively in his book about Dr. Fauci. And it were basically AIDS denialists, or people that were claiming that the drugs didn't work, or they were toxic, or that people that just needed more food, or that better sanitation, that it was misdiagnosed. And this was a problem because Mbeki himself became a problem in the rollout of HIV. But I don't want to spend too much time on that, but it's something that's sometimes overlooked, is that Mbeki himself became part of the problem. It complicated the way forward. But before we had to deal with Mbeki, we had just an issue of can you get the one of the reasons why I think that Mbeki was really opposed to rolling out treatment in South Africa is the price was $10,000. And Mbeki thought that the cost of doing that would be just shipping money to drug companies. And he wanted to use the money that they had to build infrastructure, improve the schools. He wanted to do it for economic development. And he saw he saw the drug companies as someone that was just going to just sort of crush his dreams of using the resources of South Africa in other economic development ways. Uh, uh, Sometimes when you can't afford something, people in their own mind persuade themselves it's not really necessary. I used to give people examples of, if there's something that your own kid can't wants and you don't want to pay for it, sometimes you try to persuade them out that, that's not really as good as you think, or that, this other alternative is just as good or whatever. But I think that was part of what got Becky off the rails. Anyway, I was really interested in trying to see if we could have a lower price for AIDS drugs, because, if you're in the United States, whenever a drug goes off patent, the price just falls through the floor. And I didn't see why it'd be any different for HIV drugs than it was for everything else. And so I started asking people at the WHO, what do you think the cost of making HIV drugs actually is, if you didn't have to worry about the patent protection? Because I said, you've got 35 million people that are going to die, and it seems like a pretty important thing to know. And at one point, I did one trip around the world where I spent some time in Thailand, and they had a company that was making HIV drugs, not all of them, but they were making some HIV drugs in Thailand. And I asked the woman that ran the government pharmaceutical manufacturing facility in Thailand what she estimated in a best case scenario was that you could manufacture triple therapy. And I'm trying to remember when I probably had these conversations with her in 1999, probably. And she said that she thought you could make an AIDS cocktail for about $250 a year.
And that's worth emphasizing. I just want to repeat this just so everyone understands. You had the drug companies here selling this triple therapy for $10,000 to $15,000 for a year's treatment
in South Africa. Yeah.
And here you have a drug company, and again, high quality. This isn't off the street. This isn't some back alley operation. High quality drugs, $250 a year. Just incredible difference. A factor of about 70 to 1. So anyhow, okay, go ahead.
No, but that was the estimate that she gave. Although at the time they were making some, but not all of the drugs you'd need.
Yeah.
And so MSF, who I was working with at that point, Doctors Without Borders is probably better known in the United States, but they were using this number I'd come up with, this $250 a year, as a potential a price that you could get a cheaper generic version of HIV drugs. And at the time, the WHO had assigned to somebody from a German pharmaceutical company to be leading their effort on AIDS. And he told me, he said that was just BS. He said it was just not true what I was saying, that you could make drugs that cheap. And he said you need to check out the prices of the active pharmaceutical agreement. He was just telling me that I was just like misinformation. So I had a meeting in Washington, D.C., in Ralph Nader's office with these two guys, led particularly by this guy, Bill Haddad, who was one of the people that was involved in the development of the Hatch-Waxman Act in the United States. It came out of the American generics industry. And I asked him if he could help me find people that manufactured the APIs, the active pharmaceutical ingredient that went into AIDS drugs, to get an idea of what the cost of what to manufacture the drug. And he didn't really know who it was, but he knew someone he thought did, and it was a woman named Agnes Veris, I think was her name. Anyway, she was a kind of a dealer in APIs. She was kind of a trader, and people in the generics often dealt with her. And she had contact with companies in India. So she put me in touch with a guy named with a person named Dr. Yusuf Hamid, and I was supposed to meet Dr. Yusuf Hamid in the summer of 2000, and in London. Dr. Hamid moves around a lot because I don't think he likes to pay a lot of income taxes, and so he's always looking at his watch to figure out how many days he can be in a particular country before, because he has places in Spain and the Maldives and India and UK. He moved around a lot. Anyway, I saw him in London, and Rob Weissman came with me, and so Bill Haddad and his colleague were supposed to meet us there, but Bill was late because he went through a different airport, different flight. So it was just me, Rob, and Dr. Amin having coffee, and so I, went back and forth with him, and Dr. Mead, you're an economist, so I think you sort of get it. He explained that if they make a drug and they have to if they have to register in a country, sometimes some countries expect to be bribed. The regulators do. And he says, and then once you get in the country, some doctors want also to be kind of taken care of. And so it can be quite a challenge to sort of just say you're going to sell a drug in a country that, there's a lot of steps you had to do, and it was costly for them. And sometimes if the governments were the purchasers, he said in different African countries, he wouldn't get paid. So he felt that the credit was an issue for them and what it would cost them to deliver a drug. And so I said, okay, suppose we have three scenarios. One, you have to do everything. You make the drug, you register it, and you get it to the patients, to the doctors. You take care of all, you deal with the pharmacies, all the distribution. The second one is the government buys the drug from you. And the third one is we drive a truck up to your factory in India, and we just buy them right from the factory, and we take them from there. Like, give me an idea of like how these prices come out. And I said, what's the cheapest AIDS cocktail you could make? Because at that point, there were several different cocktails that were out there. Some were protease inhibitors. Some of them were small molecules that were fairly easy to make. And so he came up with one cocktail right off the bat that he said would be the cheapest: nevirapine, 3-TC, and D4T. And I said, why these three drugs? He says, well, nevirapine, which is the third drug you use in a cocktail, is 200 milligrams, I think, twice a day. And 3-TC was 150 milligrams twice a day. And D4T was 30 or 40 milligrams twice a day. And those were the smallest amount of APIs that you could put together at that point in a feasible three-drug combination drug. And there were other drugs that were out there, but some of them would be like 1,200 milligrams a day or whatever. Or, AZT itself was twice as big of a load of 3-TC. So yeah, okay, those are the things. And then he sort of showed us how the prices work. He'd been selling APIs to Brazilians who had their own treatment programs that they developed for HIV in Brazil that had been working. And he'd explained that when they would first start selling a drug, there'd be a lot of companies that could make the manufacture it in India. The prices would be pretty high, and they'd come in a little bit under what the brand name was. But then as competition would go and more companies would enter the market, the prices would fall. And he'd show how they would go from $15,000 a kilo to under $1,000 a kilo, he showed us his trajectory historically of what prices would be. So he explained to us that over time the prices get cheaper. And I said, okay, well, what can you make this cocktail for if you were to, give it to me right now? And he said, well, he said he could do 3-TC, he could do nevirapine, which is the most expensive drug, for 65 cents a day. And he could do 3-TC for 35 cents a day. And he said he'd throw in D4T because it was so cheap to make for free. So that was $1 for the three-drug cocktail. And so I had that information and I passed it back to MSF. So then later on, actually a couple months later, I'm in Geneva. I'm at some party at this guy Bernard Picol's house, and he was running the access campaign for Doctors Without Borders, and he was saying that it was just BS. That oh, by the way, the price I got, the $350. He said if they had to sell it to a government, they'd want $800 because they weren't sure if they were going to get paid. And if they had to move it, and they'd had to, sort of move it through the registration themselves and the doctors, it would be more like $1,200 or $1,300. So he explained, and it wasn't a big surprise, that if you buy in bulk and you have solid financing and you take care of distribution, guess what? The price is going to be lower than if you go to the pharmacy and try to buy it there. I mean, it was his costs were important to him, and so if you wanted to get a cheaper drug, you could do it, but you'd have to sort of think through like what the terms of the transaction were. I didn't think there was any mystery here. I mean, I thought solid financing, take care of distribution, pay cash, that you should be able to get a good price. So MSF was not getting a good price from in their negotiations with Dr. Mead. So I offered to take over the negotiation for them. And it took me about a day and a half to work out a deal. Dr. Mead didn't want to sell it cheap to MSF because he thought everyone would want the same price, but not everyone would de-risk the whole, supply chain in the same way. He thought other people would want the low price, but maybe have a lousy credit or maybe, not take care of distribution. So I said, just call the MSF price a humanitarian price, because that's at the time the drug companies were giving very small discounts on their pricey cocktails of like 30% or something like that, calling that a humanitarian price. And I said, just call it a humanitarian price, and that way you can say it's special for MSF. So he agreed, and then I sent that to Donald McNeil at the New York Times. And the next day he had a front page story about this $1 a day cocktail, and it was syndicated around the world, and it really shook things up. And it led in 2001 to a whole chain of events, which led to a WTO agreement in the fall and a proposal by Kofi Annan, who won the Nobel Prize for this, to create the Global Fund for HIV and AIDS. So there was this series of events which flew from that. And by the way, the price initially of $350 was down to about $240 by the end of the year, within like about 6 months, because other companies kind of competed with Cipla and drove the price down. So the initial tie quote was pretty accurate. Nowadays, I think you could probably get an HIV cocktail for closer to $50 a year or $60 a year from PEPFAR prices. But
so let me just stop you for a moment. I just want to emphasize, because it really is an incredible story. And, it's both incredible in terms of the pricing, but obviously more importantly in terms of the number of lives it saved. So here you have drugs being sold in the U.S., 10 to 15,000 for a year's treatment. And it's possible to produce them at that time for $300, $250 for a year's treatment. And as Jamie's saying, even lower today. But the point here is that, you talk about sub-Saharan Africa, extremely poor. I mean, it's poor then, it's still poor. It's not as though they've suddenly gotten rich in the last quarter century. But in any case, the idea of providing drugs, and even at the discount price, $7,000, whatever, pharmaceutical companies would give them, that's prohibitive. You couldn't envision that you're going to have a program, whether it's US, UN, whatever it might be, for 10 million people where you're paying out somewhere around $7,000 a person. I mean, you might like to say that would be a good thing, but realistically, that's not going to happen. But when you talk about $250, $300 a person, suddenly that's a very feasible target. And that's what, Kofi Annan at the UN, and then I'll let you chime back in and talk about how it's picked up in the US. But it was feasible to treat millions or tens of millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa at that price. So it was just, a really remarkable game changer.
Yeah, let me get a little more context on the pricing. And that was that there was no global fund, and there wasn't really much in the way of global donor funds for HIV at the time. But there were people that could pay out of pocket a certain amount of money. And so some people would say, well, what's the point of even at that price, people can't afford it. I said, well, some people can. I mean, the people that were dying were engineers, telephone repair people, teachers. I mean, there were all sorts of people, the professionals that could clearly pay, they could clearly pay $1 a day. And then there was a mining company, Anglo-American, I think it was an Anglo-American, or it was a very big mining company. And this Dr. Brinks, I think his name was, but he was saying that it was cheaper for them to treat the workers than to retrain new workers after the other ones died or got sick. So he said at a certain point, they would provide the drugs, to their workers because it was just cost effective for them as miners. So there was a lot of sectors we knew that you couldn't save everyone, but it didn't mean you shouldn't save anyone. I mean, it was kind of like we were just trying to do what we could. So we knew at a certain point you could provide opportunities for people that would help a lot of people, and it wouldn't help everyone at that point, but it would help quite a few people. And that was sort of our initial thought. Now, the PEPFAR announcement, which later came from President Bush, which was really a big deal, I talked to Mitch Daniels, who was Ralph Nader was a good friend of Mitch Daniels. They were both they were both ethnically from the same region, kind of. I think Mitch's family was from Syria, and Ralph's from Lebanon, and and we used to meet regularly with Mitch, and a very nice person, by the way. And he was the head of Office of Management and Budget for Bush at the time, and he told us that at $1,000 or $1,200 a year, he thought that HIV drugs would be not cost effective. He was a big cost benefit guy, and he thought you could spend a bit money better on infrastructure, roads, clean water, things like that. But he thought at $1 a day, it changed everything. And he thought at $1 a day, it became a moral imperative that they make the drugs available through these donor funds. And so he thought that the change in price completely changed the attitude of the Bush administration in terms of whether they should step up and provide support. And Bush was really good at that. And it's really a shame to see Elon Musk and Donald Trump dismantle what had been for decades not only a bipartisan supported program and providing support for HIV drugs, but also a great foreign policy initiative for the U.S. I mean, it was really deeply appreciated in the countries where the donor programs that the United States had been one of the big supporters of saved so many lives. It was very cost effective.
I'll have you pick up there in a second, but I just want to repeat that. So just again, I mean, I was, as you might imagine, I was a skeptic of anything George W. Bush did. And, in fact, Jamie, I probably wrote a thing or two being very skeptical that this was anything more than a PR stunt. But it was the real thing. And, it saved tens of millions of lives. And again, as Jamie was saying, this bipartisan starts by George W. Bush, a very conservative Republican, enjoyed support across the aisle. And in the scheme of things, very cheap. I mean, what were we spending on it? $6 billion a year, $7 billion, which, it's a lot of money for us. But, in terms of the federal budget, it's less than 1/10 of 1% of the federal budget. And you're saving tens of millions of lives. So big deal. And okay, so now we have Elon Musk and his chainsaws. I don't even know where, I know they shut it down. You could tell us where it stands today. Where is it going? If you have any idea where it's going.
I mean, it's it's very fluid. I mean, the whole AIDS world is being rocked right now. I mean, they started out by firing everyone at USAID that was involved in supporting the program, and supposedly PEPFAR has some kind of a carve out, but it's not really obvious how that's playing out. Other countries are pulling back now because they're shifting their money to defense from aid programs. So you see a lot of European countries now reducing the amount of money they spend on development and AIDS programs. So that's very, very, very tough. By the way, you mentioned bipartisan. When Bush first announced the program, the drug companies got them to condition the PEPFAR that the drugs had to be FDA approved. And I think for a lot of us, we felt that what he's doing is he's basically creating a subsidy by not buying the Indian products, which were like way cheaper than the Merck and the Pfizer and the GSK versions of the product. But they created a system within the FDA that an Indian drug manufacturer could get a tentative FDA approval for anything that was in the PEPFAR program And they could get a quality signal out of the FDA, even though they were not legal to sell the drugs in the United States of America. And that actually ended up having a very positive effect for the Indian manufacturers, because the drug companies were always trying to attack the Indian manufacturers, saying their products were substandard, they didn't work as well, and things like that. But once they had the FDA approval, then it really increased the demand for the products, and it really, legitimized it in a lot of ways. And so it was a short period when the subsidies were primarily to the brand name companies, but that transitioned pretty rapidly to the Indian generics being the primary beneficiaries of the.
A couple of points I just want to emphasize there. So again, just hitting on how cheap these drugs are to manufacture. And again, it's easy for us. I sometimes give a talk. I'll say drugs are cheap, and people look at me like I'm an idiot. I go, they're cheap to manufacture. It's very rare that you have a drug that's actually expensive to manufacture and distribute. They're expensive because we have patent monopolies or other types of protection. So the drug companies, they could still, suppose they were selling around 1,000, 2,000, their low cost versions. They're still making plenty of money on that. So you could get the Indian version for $250, $300. If they're selling it, they have the same production cost, more or less, maybe a little bit higher. But if they're selling it for 1,000 or 2,000, they're making plenty of money on it. So again, it's a great thing. It's better than, try and charge 10 or 15, but it's a lot more money that could otherwise go for treating more people. So that's, just a very, very important factor. And again, it speaks well to the people in the Bush administration that they were able to insist on, the lower cost. The other point is that, again, with the FDA, we all want to ensure that the drugs we get are safe, but this could also be a process to exclude competition. So this happens all the time that, when you have some safety protection that, again, it's a legitimate thing, but you could have industry groups, in effect, commandeer that to exclude their competition. And obviously, that's what the drug companies were attempting to do here. And thankfully, they were able to get around that.
Yeah, I think you still see some regulatory barriers. Certainly, the biosimilar pathway in the United States is more difficult than it is in Europe, and it's probably excessively difficult. The regulatory barriers have become one of the major ways that companies have tried to protect cell therapies, gene therapies, and biologic drugs from competition. And there is a lot of capture of the regulators, not just here, but in Europe as well. Let me give you an example of something more current that we're working on. There's a disease, spinal muscular atrophy, which is affects maybe, it's a genetic disease, affects maybe 1 in 10,000, maybe 1 in 12,000 live births by some estimates. And it used to be one of the leading causes of infant mortality in the United States. But now there's 3 treatments, one gene therapy and 2 drugs for this that have all come out of a combination of charity and NIH funding. And one of the drugs is a small molecule Resisplan, which is a 5 milligram a day drug that you can give with an eyedropper. You can mail the powder version of it through the mail and reconstitute it in bottled water and keep it in a refrigerator for 2 months, and a parent can deliver it with an eyedropper. So and if a child gets this very early on, it doesn't reverse the damage of the disease, but it prevents it from moving forward. You can have almost like a normal life for a kid. And if kids get it later, if they don't get any treatment at all for this disease, they'll die. Half of them will die before they're 2 years old. With half of them have one version that's pretty deadly. But it's a terrible disease of not being able to walk, having all kind of. I don't want to get into all the graphic details, but it's a rough disease, but now treatable. And almost no access in developing countries to this drug, even though it's super profitable. And it's priced at $1,000 a day, and it doesn't cure you. You have to take it every day going forward. So it's nearly 400. The U.S. price is about $400,000 a year. So we also looked at this question of what you could make it. There was a graduate student at Howard University that synthesized the drug as a class project, it's not that difficult to make. We figure we could probably make the drug for in the quantities we're talking about, probably a couple $100 a year, maybe, as opposed to like $1,000 a day. And so one of the issues is, can we get a regulator to say that the generic version is an acceptable quality? So we had talks with the European regulators, the European Medicines Agency, and we said, can you do for this drug what the U.S. did for HIV drugs, which was give tentative approval of the drug? And they said, no, we can't look at a drug until it's been on the market for 10 years under the Orphan Drug Act. And I said, can a national government that has its own regulatory authority, which is allowed to approve generic drugs, like in Italy or in Spain, could we talk to them? And they said no, because it's considered an orphan product, and we have now exclusive competence at the European Medicines Agency for all orphan products, and they cannot be approved at the national level for regulatory for safety thing. Well, I said, can we explore like things you could do short of? We're not asking for approval to sell in the European Union. We're asking you to sort of work with us on trying to give more assurance to families that have children with this disease that the products are safety. And at one point, I said, what we're talking about here is a policy failure. You have a drug that costs maybe a couple $100, maybe less per year to make. This $1,000 a day, and you have kids, half of whom dying before they're 2, and the other ones, in a really, really messed up situation in terms of their physical situation for the rest of their lives, and there are treatments that could do it that were developed by charities and governments, and they're not available. And I said, I think we have a moral responsibility to fix this. And then the person we have about 5 people we were talking to with the European Medicines Agency in that meeting, and one of them said, "This meeting's over."
Wow.
and they were unhappy with the way and that's not how we led in the meeting. But at a certain point, you have to say the obvious, like we know what the policy is, but can we agree that the policy is bad, right? There's something wrong with a policy like this. It's children that you're talking about, even if it wasn't children. But
is that where it stands now, or?
Well, I think we've seen. We're not giving up on anything. So
No, I know you don't give up, James. I just where it stands at the moment. Well, I don't want to keep you all day here, but I do want to give you a chance to talk about your prize fund idea, because I have a lot of back and forth, as you might imagine, with economists, and I talk about drugs. And it's one of these things, even economists, it's not that I think economists are the smartest people in the world, but they are people that work with the economy, look at data. They don't realize how much money's at stake, in aggregate with prescription drugs. And, I sometimes give them the number. They go, where are you getting that from? It's the National Income and Product Accounts. It's produced by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. I'm not making it up, and I give them the exact line that they can go look it up. We're going to spend around $650 billion this year on prescription drugs. Well, prescription and related drugs, I should say, because some are no longer prescription. But in any case, around $650 billion. That's about a little over 2%, about 2.3% of GDP. It's about $5,000 per household. It's a huge, huge amount of money. If we snapped our fingers, we got rid of all the patents, there are other protections. It's more complicated. Jamie can tell you about it. I'm not going to let him do it here. But it would probably be around $100 billion. Because, again, these drugs are rarely expensive to manufacture and distribute. They're expensive because we give patent monopolies. So enormous amount of money at stake, lives at stake. People could afford the drugs when they're available as generics. They oftentimes can't. That's why we have the GoFundMe. Someone has cancer and it costs $100,000 a year. Their insurance won't pay it. That's incredible. It's horrible. There's a drug that could save them or extend their life, and they have to go around begging to get the money for it. If we're available as a cheap generic, $200, $300, maybe $1,000, but certainly much, much more affordable. And, so that's the story. And when you engage economists, as they should, they say, okay, but it is expensive to develop the drugs. And that's exactly right. So the question is, are there alternatives? And Jamie, I have my own ideas that's not worth getting into today, but Jamie has an alternative. I'll let him, outline the story there and just say what an alternative mechanism for supporting the research and the development of prescription drugs would be.
Yeah, in terms of the cost difference, we do know that about 91% of the prescriptions are generic, but over, I forget the exact number what it is today, but close to 90% of the costs are from the branded products. So you can work out the math in terms of the relative price, but it's huge, and so I think you pointed a different issue. There's plenty of money in the system. It's just not very well organized from the point of view of the buyers. So I think there was two people that motivated me to look at these delinkage ideas, and you were one of them, and Michael Kramer was the other. Michael Kramer, it was at the time the Bill Gates professor of economics at Harvard, and he won the Nobel Prize later for his work on development. But he had what we thought with Jeffrey Sachs was a really bad proposal for expanding access to vaccines. He wanted the government to come up with like a $7 billion advanced purchase fund for a vaccine for malaria. And he had a hard time explaining where the $7 billion came on, or what would happen if you how would you decide what qualified, and what if there was more than one product, one vaccine? The mechanical details were kind of a mess. And he presented that in 1999. I remember seeing this presentation, and then not long after, I saw you make a presentation at some Rockefeller retreat where you were talking about the dead weight loss of pharmaceutical drugs, and you had some statistics you were opposed. And I thought to myself, well, in a way, both people are making the same point, which is that the marginal cost of the products are probably pretty low. Now, I think the reason why you had this conversation coming from Kramer was he was funded by Gates, and Gates was addicted to the monopoly. He just loved the idea that you'd have and he loved IP, he loved patents, he loved the idea that big pharma would.
He literally called people who challenged patents. He might have been one of them. He called them communists. It was really kind of hostile. So I think that Kramer and Sachs at the time didn't really have any flexibility on this. They had to kind of come out with, and so the Gates story was there's nothing wrong with the current system except poor people don't have enough money. And so if the donors from the West put up the money to buy the drugs, then the market will work for them. So it was all the idea. And at the time, we were not really that big on the donor model, even though we just talked about a successful donor market, which is kind of coming to an end for HIV. But it's sustainability means you don't really want to depend on donors. And what's happening right now is a pretty good example. Why not? Now, but your system was more have the government take a bigger role in all aspects of drug development, manufacturing, and things like that. Now, I was working with a guy named Tim Hubbard at the time, and Tim Hubbard is at the time he was at the Wellcome Trust, and he was working on the Human Genome Project, and he's a scientist, and my background's in economics, and but both Tim and I like competition, and we like risk taking, and we like we like the idea that you can actually lose money if you perform badly in some cases. I mean, we think it sort of focuses the mind, and we don't like centralized bureaucracy and group think. So we were trying to think: can you come up with an idea to make a competitive market for drug development that doesn't rely on high prices and monopoly prices, which have this huge social cost and huge inequality and lots of other well-known flaws, like, for example, excessive incentives to develop products which match healthcare outcomes instead of improving healthcare outcomes. Right now, if you have a drug that works like X, you can make a ton of money by getting around the patent protection
if you can, and having a product that does roughly the same thing and has roughly the same outcomes, even though the patients are no better off. And if you have two products that are roughly the same, you're going to spend a lot of money on marketing to distinguish your product from their product. And there's a lot of goes on in that area. So there's a lot of waste involved in the current system.
Also, I should point out, and as you well know, often dishonesty, because, obviously if you're trying to get people to buy your drugs, you have a very strong incentive to understate the side effects, the possible harmful side effects, and to overstate the benefits. And that literally happens all the time for obvious reasons. They have a big incentive.
Yeah, and some of the trials that they do that they couldn't publish in regular journals sometimes, but they'd call seeding trials or they'd be marketing trials. They would maybe compare their product in an unfair way with another product or something like that. But it's kind of, but the whole thing was relatively waste. If you had a product which did something, and you developed a Me Too product that's roughly the same thing, in a way, that's a pretty expensive thing to get you where you already were. So we had this idea that you can use prizes, and actually Kramer's work had emphasized the role of prizes in the past. In his papers he'd written, he'd talk about prize system and stuff like that. The problem was he had the same problem he had in his advanced purchase fund. He had the idea that the social planner could figure out in advance what the outcome should be to get the prize. So you know, like exactly what efficacy it'd have to be, what disease, stuff like that. And Tim and I didn't really like that. So we thought, well, what if what wins isn't really a product, but a health outcome? And we don't think that in the beginning what the health outcome will be a product. I think that emerges over time, because in our experience, some drugs end up being better than you thought or worse than you thought over time. So we said the effective patent monopoly people used to think it was like 7 to 10 years. It's closer to 14 or more now. But we said, suppose you had 10 paydays over a period of a decade, and every year you get to submit your data, which you establish the benefits of your drug. But you do it in an environment where everyone else submits their data, and you have a competition among people as supply innovations, and you have a zero-sum payout, so that if Dean gets more, I get less, or vice versa. So the better your drug is, the more money you get, but the better your opponent's drug is the less money you get. So people basically, the payout becomes kind of a market-determined payout based upon competition among suppliers. We had other things. Dean came up with one good idea, and that you asked me, well, what do you do if products come about in roughly the same time? You create kind of an inefficient race to the last mile or whatever like that. Is it a winner take all at that point? Because we had the idea that you'd measure the benefits of your product benchmarked against existing treatments before your product came into market, and then we there was a bill already written on this at this point. By Sanders in 2005. It was written in 2004, 2003, 2004, but introduced in January of 2005. And then we will later modify based on some of the comments that you had made. And then we eventually added some other, I'm skipping on a lot of details. We end up with some other bells and whistles later, but the architecture of the bills, which we thought we're very proud of, we thought were really a good system. And I'll tell you what the main problem was. It wasn't the payout system, which we felt pretty comfortable with. It was the transition. You can design a very elegant way of rewarding innovation that you can persuade people would work and is rational, and the industry would be comfortable with the payout. But then they'd say, well, how you get from here to there, because you're sitting there, there's all kinds of money sunk in development projects, you have products in the market, you have companies with stock market valuation. How do you transition from here to there? And that was a problem that was the weakest part, we thought, of our proposal. But then we looked at some of the work that some people look at patent evergreening we're doing, and we said, okay, what if we do this? What if we say you introduce a new system, but for the first 14 years, you keep the old system and you only apply the alternative reward system to the monopoly after 14 years. In other words, everything has a compulsory license and deep technology transfer after 14 years of monopoly. And most people think that's not going to really be an unreasonable thing to introduce the idea that you cap, because people think it's a policy failure if the monopoly goes beyond 14 years right now. And the amount of money you'd have to throw out at the to compensate for the loss of incentive by capping the incentive at 14 years would not be that much, because only a few products would really be affected by that.
Yeah.
And then you go to we figured out how to do that. We made some mistakes, but we're learning. Let's cap it at 13 years and put more money into the alternative reward system or subsidies that you replace it with. And then we go from 13 to 12. And then you just basically, over the course of a generation, you'd eliminate the monopoly. You wouldn't do it right away, but you'd keep shaving a year off the allowed monopoly, and then you'd progressively increase the size of the alternative reward. So the alternative reward would get bigger as the monopoly got smaller.
You're much more generous to them in the transition. I understand the politics, but than I would be. But let me just outline that, because I think it might confuse people.
On that, one quick up is that there was a bill it was 3 pages in the budget reconciliation bill last fall. The 1,500-page bill on this topic that set out from Senator Cassidy and Bernie Sanders together, bipartisan, conservative Republican Bernie, that asked the national academies to study the feasibility of the progressive implementation of full linkage like this, and we were really happy, and Sanders people were really happy, because we thought finally we were going to get this National Academy study on the feasibility of this thing done. And then Elon Musk blows up the budget bill, and the bill was actually never really introduced. It's on the webpage of the Senate, but it's not. It doesn't have a bill title. I've got a memo I'm about to put out, which sort of make sure that there's a good record of it, because it was a really pretty good terms of reference, actually.
Yeah. But let me just, again, I just wanted to outline that, and I'll let you get running in a minute, but just to emphasize this point here. So again, the idea here is to fund the research separately from the price. So as it stands now, basically you have the patent monopolies allowing the drug companies to recoup their costs and, of course, profit from selling their drugs. And that's why it's expensive. So Jamie's, the system he worked through is an alternative mechanism. Drug companies will still get rewarded for their work. Again, assuming it's good. Obviously, they shouldn't be rewarded if it's bad. But the drugs will all be sold. They'll be available as cheap generics. So you're separating the price that people pay for the drug from how we fund the research. And again, there's issues with the mechanics of it. Nothing's going to be perfect, but no one can look at the system today and say it's anything close to perfect. And just, again, I'm glad you mentioned Cassidy, because again, the point here is that there is bipartisan interest. And one of the issues, not that I'm going to hold out great hopes for RFK Jr., but he's sort of rallied this hostility to the pharmaceutical industry, which much of it is very justified. But, it's, I'm not confident of him taking it in a good direction. But the point is that there are a lot of people, and it's not just sort of far left Democrats. There's a lot of people across the country who don't like paying really high drug prices. They don't trust the pharmaceutical industry. That creates a potential for talking about serious reforms like what Jamie's put forward.
Yeah, my wife has been a cancer patient for 15 years, and her drugs, which she still takes, are $9,000 a week.
That's incredible. That's incredible.
Breast cancer, which is not really a rare disease or anything like that. It's like buying a house every year. I mean, it's just crazy.
Yeah. Well, Jamie, thanks a lot for coming on. I really appreciate you going through this. And again, these are incredibly important stories that I think, not known widely, underappreciated. And, I'm really glad you're out there in the trenches working on it. You've accomplished a huge amount. I'm sure you'll accomplish much, much more. And obviously we all have our hands full with going after Elon Musk and his chainsaw, but hopefully we'll make some progress. Thanks.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's always been really great engaging with you on these topics.
If you like what you just saw, please help us out by liking us and subscribing.